You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. A couple of weeks ago, in episode 318, we spoke with Claire Casey, who's an interpretive ranger at the St. Geneviéve National Historical Park. Now, after Claire and I finished our formal conversation about St. Genevieve's very interesting colonial history in the heartland of North America, Claire mentioned that she actually had some more information about St. Genevieve's transition from a French colony to an American settlement under the governance of the United States. Now, in combination with Claire's extra information, I also had several of your questions that we couldn't quite get to in the course of our full-length conversation. So Claire stayed on with me, and we created this short bonus episode. Now, during our briefer conversation, Claire answers your questions about challenges Claire and her National Park Service colleagues face in trying to tell the story of French and Spanish colonization here in North America, and about the relationships between St. Genevieve's inhabitants and the settlement's Indigenous neighbors, and how that relationship changed over time. Now, before we travel back to Colonial St. Geneviéve, this type of bonus episode that you're about to hear is very similar to the types of bonus episodes you'll hear each month as a subscriber to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program. To find out more about how you can help support your favorite history podcast by becoming a subscriber, visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Are you ready to head back to St. Geneviéve, Missouri? Let's go rejoin Claire Casey. Claire, thank you so much for staying on with us. In our full-length conversation in episode 318, we talked a fair bit about the legal and cultural changes that happened and really didn't happen within this culturally French community of St. Geneviéve after the settlement transitioned from French to United States governance around 1804. After our conversation, you mentioned that you had a bit more information about the changes that came with American governance. Would you tell us about these other changes that took place when St. Geneviéve went from being a French colonial city to an American city?
So we do see some other changes in the day-to-day life, particularly a bit more of an interest in education. Eventually, we get to public education, but even before then, we start to see more of an interest in providing some education for both men and women here. And though it is another kind of legal change, we also see the introduction of trial by jury, which is a big shift from the colonial period when it was you head to the commandant or another official to manage any complaints or any issues. We also see more class stratification as people are taking advantage of some of the opportunities that a new country brings or being part of a new country. And as people struggle to maintain their position that they gained in the colonial period, and we start to see a little bit more of those classes start to show up here in St. Geneviéve as well.
Now, Philippe is curious about the challenges that you and your colleagues face, given that you interpret French and Spanish colonial history rather than what we've come to view as a more mainstream Anglo-American experience.
We have more logistical issues with that in terms of a lot of the primary sources are in Spanish and French and things like that, having to rely on some translations and some work by previous scholars in ways that you don't necessarily have to when it's a document in a language that you understand. And we also are dealing with sharing these stories with the public who is not familiar oftentimes with these other colonial systems. And we often have to check our own assumptions as well. It's easy to think that because it was at the same time that things operate in the same way, and even just little minor things that you don't expect to be different oftentimes are. So we have to be a little bit more careful. We have to find some good translations or find someone who understands and make sure that when we're sharing it with the public that we're starting with base one and make sure that we're breaking down those assumptions before digging into these stories and the differences here.
Now, Kristen is interested in the differences between the French relationship with St. Genevieve's Indigenous neighbors and later relationships that Anglo-Americans would have after the Louisiana Purchase. So, Claire, could you tell us how imperialism and nationality informed St. Genevieve's relationships with its Indigenous neighbors?
The French were very interested in working with the native nations. Again, no relationship was perfect at that time, but we do see some more willingness to work to a mutually beneficial relationship, to the point that we see that the French are willing to consider American Indians in St. Genevieve as French if they meet some conditions. So there is a level of required assimilation there. They generally required, being Catholic and some of those types of changes, but then they would just be considered French. They were written in the records as French. It was a concept that even once it was kind of dropped as a possibility on the formal higher levels of government, on the ground, it still kind of plays out. And so early on, there's this idea of identity being a bit more malleable. That identity isn't necessarily considered as innate. And to compare that to when this becomes the United States and the American approach, we don't see Native American citizenship until much later in the history here. And so that is a pretty big difference in how they were approaching, all these different nations here and how they related to them. We also see a lot more intermarriage under the French. And part of that is, again, a mutually beneficial type of situation to increase trade. And then you have someone who understands some of the local languages and, has an in with other nations or with their own nation, at least in their family. And we don't see that as quite as accepted, although it certainly still happens plenty in American history. There's a bit more of that kind of us and them sense later on.
Speaking of United States history, as a follow-up, Kristen would like to know how the American settlement of Missouri and the Great Plains impacted St. Genevieve's relationship with its Indigenous neighbors. Did the fact that there was so much Western migration by white Americans cause tensions between St. Genevieve and its traditional Indigenous trading partners?
Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that, as our focus as a park is much more on the colonial history and that early transition. And eventually we'll probably research outside of that just to add on to these stories, but we haven't gotten to a place where we've been able to yet. We see in the patterns of St. Genevieve that as people came in during any time period, it would add to tensions as people were trading outside of the accepted kind of agreement. There would be sort of you can be here as long as you trade with us and don't go over here, and that kind of agreement. And so as more people came in and as that started to shift, that creates tensions. So it's likely that same type of pattern continued as these major shifts in migration and laws happen here in St. Genevieve. But I can't really speak to any particular examples or say anything for sure.
Claire Casey, thank you for telling us even more about the history of St. Genevieve and the St. Genevieve National Historical Park.
Thanks again for having me. And if anyone has any questions, we're always happy to hear from people.
If you enjoyed this added information about St. Genevieve, be sure you listen to our full-length conversation with Claire Casey in episode 318. You'll find that episode in your favorite podcast app or by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/318. I hope you and yours have a wonderful and very happy new year. I can't believe that we're switching from 2021 to 2022 tomorrow, but there it is, we're doing it. So I hope you and your family have a wonderful holiday, and I'm really looking forward to joining you again on Tuesday in the new year with a brand new episode of Ben Franklin's World. Would you like to know what our first historical exploration of the new year will be? I'll give you a hint. We're going to visit Colonial Cuba. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.